Edward Bennett had everything: wealth, power, control. A luxury cruise was supposed to be a rare moment of indulgence, a break from the relentless pace of his life. But the moment a little girl ran up to him, grabbed his hand, and called him daddy, his entire world tilted off its axis. He didn't have a daughter. At least, that's what he had always believed. But when he locked eyes with the woman rushing toward them, panic flashing in her gaze, he realized the past had finally caught up with him. And this time, there was no walking away. Edward Bennett had never been the type of man to take vacations. For as long as he could remember, his life had been about building his empire, making decisions that shaped industries, and ensuring that nothing, absolutely nothing, interfered with his vision for success. But even the most powerful men had their limits, and after months of relentless work, he had allowed himself this brief indulgence, a week-long cruise aboard one of the most luxurious ships in the world. The cruise had everything he could possibly need. Private suites with panoramic ocean views, Michelin-starred dining, a personal concierge for every guest. It was designed for people like him, those who lived in excess and expected perfection. But despite the beauty of the open sea and the comfort of his surroundings, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. He thrived in boardrooms, not on sunlit decks sipping cocktails. That evening, he made his way to the ship's upscale restaurant, hoping that a quiet dinner might help him relax. The atmosphere was elegant but subdued, with soft jazz playing in the background and waiters moving gracefully between tables. He took a seat near the window, ordered a glass of red wine, and prepared to enjoy a rare moment of solitude. Then he heard it. "Daddy." The voice was high-pitched and filled with pure, unshakable joy. Edward barely had time to react before a small figure rushed toward him, tiny feet padding across the polished floor. Before he could move, she stopped right in front of him, tilting her head up to look at him with the widest green eyes he had ever seen. Edward froze. The little girl couldn't have been older than 5. She had long, dark brown hair that fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and her green eyes, so bright, so full of innocence, locked onto his with absolute certainty. She looked at him as if she had known him forever. And then, before he could say a word, she spoke again. "You came back." Edward's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of the other guests' stares as the restaurant fell into hushed silence, the waiters stopping mid-step. He had no idea who this child was. And yet, she was looking at him with an expression so raw and full of happiness that something deep inside him twisted painfully. Then, just as suddenly, another voice cut through the moment, this one sharp, urgent, and laced with panic. "I'm so sorry." A woman rushed forward, grabbing the little girl's hand. She was wearing the uniform of the ship's housekeeping staff, her brown hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. Her dark eyes, filled with something between shock and dread, flicked up to meet his. Edward stared at her, and something inside his mind clicked. The familiarity in her face, the way she looked at him as if she had been bracing for this moment. He knew her. And in that instant, everything changed. The restaurant remained unnervingly silent as Edward stared at the woman in front of him. The little girl still clung to his leg, her bright green eyes looking up at him with an expression so full of trust it made his chest tighten. The woman, however, looked the complete opposite. Her dark brown eyes were wide with panic, her lips slightly parted as if she was struggling to find the right words. Edward took a slow breath, steadying himself. "Who are you?" His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an unmistakable sharpness to it. He had spent years perfecting that tone, one that commanded answers. The woman's fingers curled into the fabric of her uniform. "Mr. Bennett, she stopped, exhaling shakily. "My name is Isabella Cruz." The name struck something deep in his memory. It had been years since he had last heard it, but the familiarity of it wrapped around his mind like a ghost of the past. He studied her face, the delicate angles of her features, the way her dark hair framed her sharp cheekbones. It had been a long time, but now that he was looking at her, there was no mistaking it. His jaw tensed. Boston. 6 years ago. Isabella's expression flickered with something unreadable, relief, fear, guilt, maybe all three. She nodded slowly. Edward's stomach twisted. His voice came out quieter now, but no less intense. What the hell is going on? Isabella glanced down at the little girl, her fingers tightening around the child's small hand. Edward followed her gaze, his eyes scanning the little girl's face, the way her features held an eerie resemblance to his own. The dark brown hair, the shape of her nose, the slight dimple in her cheek. But it was the eyes that confirmed it. They were his. His heart pounded in his chest. He forced himself to meet Isabella's gaze again, his entire body tense. Is she mine? Isabella didn't answer right away. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Edward had seen many emotions in his life, fear, desperation, even love, but what he saw in her eyes now was something different. Regret. Then, finally, she nodded. Edward felt the air leave his lungs. He had been blindsided in business negotiations before, had faced ruthless competitors who tried to strip him of everything, but nothing had ever hit him like this. The little girl tugged at his sleeve. Daddy. The word sent a shockwave through him. His chest tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He wanted to say something, but his throat felt dry. Isabella crouched down beside the little girl, her voice soft but firm. Lily, sweetheart, let's go. The little girl frowned. But I just found him. Edward's entire body locked up. Just found him. The words replayed in his mind over and over, unraveling something deep inside of him. How many times had this child wondered about him? Had she spent nights asking for a father she had never met? Had Isabella told her about him, or had she been left to wonder, to create her own version of him in her young mind? He finally found his voice. You kept her from me. Isabella looked up sharply, her dark eyes flashing with something defensive. It's not that simple. Edward clenched his jaw. The hell it isn't. I had a right to know. Her lips pressed together, but she didn't argue. Lily looked between them, confusion evident in her small features. Mommy? Isabella's face softened. It's okay, baby. Let's go. Edward took a step forward. We're not done here. Isabella hesitated, but then she nodded. Fine. But not here. She turned to one of the waiters, murmured something apologetically, and then led Lily away toward the exit. Edward followed, his pulse still hammering, his mind still trying to catch up with what had just happened. His daughter. He had a daughter. And he had just found out about her 5 years too late. Edward followed Isabella through the quiet hallways of the cruise ship, his footsteps heavy against the polished floor. His mind was racing, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him like a vice. He had walked into that restaurant expecting nothing more than a quiet dinner, a brief escape from his work, from the relentless control he held over every aspect of his life. And yet, in the span of a few minutes, everything had unraveled. The little girl, Lily, walked beside Isabella, her small hand wrapped around her mother's fingers, completely unaware of the storm brewing between the adults. She hummed softly, as if she hadn't just thrown his world into chaos. Edward couldn't stop staring at her, his eyes tracing every familiar feature, every resemblance to himself. The curve of her jaw, the soft wave of her dark brown hair, but most of all, her eyes. Those unmistakable blue-green eyes that belonged to him. Isabella led them to a quieter section of the ship, away from the elegant lounges and crowded dining halls, stopping outside one of the employee cabins. She let out a slow breath before unlocking the door, pushing it open, and stepping inside. Edward hesitated for a moment before following, feeling an unfamiliar sense of unease settle in his chest. The cabin was small, much different from the luxurious suite he occupied. A modest bed took up most of the space, a few shelves lined with neatly folded clothes and a worn-out teddy bear perched on the pillow. Lily climbed onto the bed without hesitation, grabbing a coloring book and flipping through the pages, completely unbothered by the tension in the room. Edward crossed his arms, his sharp gaze locking onto Isabella. "Start talking." She exhaled, running a hand through her dark brown hair, her expression tired. "I know you're angry." He let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Angry doesn't even begin to cover it. You kept my child from me, Isabella. You let me walk away without ever telling me I had a daughter." She flinched slightly, but she didn't look away. "You left." His jaw clenched. "I didn't leave a child. I left a woman I had a one-night stand with. A woman who never once mentioned she was pregnant." She let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table beside her. "I didn't know how to tell you." Edward narrowed his eyes. "You didn't know how, or you didn't want to?" She swallowed hard. "Both." Silence filled the room, thick with years of things left unsaid. Edward could feel his pulse hammering in his temples, the weight of the revelation settling deeper into his bones. He had spent his whole life making calculated decisions, controlling outcomes, ensuring that nothing ever caught him off guard. But this was something he could have never predicted. Finally, Isabella spoke again, her voice softer this time. "You weren't exactly the kind of man who wanted a family, Edward. You were focused on your career, on success, on power. I convinced myself that telling you would only complicate things, that you wouldn't want to be involved." His chest tightened. "You never gave me the chance to decide." She nodded, guilt flickering across her face. "I know. And I won't make excuses for that. I thought I was protecting her." Edward glanced at Lily, who was now coloring quietly, completely oblivious to the conversation happening around her. She looked so peaceful, so trusting. And yet, she had spent her whole life not knowing him. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. "Did she ever ask about me?" Isabella hesitated before nodding. "She's always been curious. I never lied to her. I told her you existed, that you were far away. But I didn't know how to explain why you weren't here." Edward's stomach twisted at the thought. Lily suddenly looked up, her bright green eyes locking onto his. "Are you staying, Daddy?" The word still sent a shock through him. He wasn't used to it, wasn't prepared for the way it made something deep inside him shift. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. He faltered, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. "I don't know." Lily tilted her head, considering his answer, before giving him a small smile. "That's okay. You're here now." Edward felt something inside him crack. This little girl didn't look at him with anger for not being there. She didn't ask him why he had never come. She simply accepted him as he was, without hesitation. And that terrified him more than anything else. Edward had never felt uncertain in his life. Every move he had ever made was calculated, every decision backed by logic, strategy, and control. But sitting in Isabella's small cabin, watching his daughter, color as if nothing in the world had changed, he felt completely unprepared. Nothing in his years of experience, in his world of power and business, had prepared him for this. Lily hummed softly to herself as she carefully shaded in a flower on the page. Every now and then, she would glance up at him with those bright green eyes, as if checking to make sure he was still there. It was such a simple thing, yet it made something tighten in his chest. She expected him to be there. As if she had always expected him. Isabella shifted on the chair across from him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked exhausted. He could see it now, the sleepless nights, the weight she carried. It wasn't just about the secret she had kept. It was about raising a child alone, working to support her, carrying the burden of a decision she had made years ago. Edward took a deep breath, trying to ground himself. I need to know everything, he said finally, his voice quieter than before. Start from the beginning. Isabella hesitated, looking down at her hands. I found out I was pregnant a few weeks after you left Boston, she said. I tried to reach out, but you had already moved on to your next project, your next city. You were impossible to get a hold of. Edward clenched his jaw. You could have tried harder. She let out a short, humorless laugh. Do you really believe that? Do you think you would have answered a call from some woman you barely knew? You weren't exactly the type to look back, Edward. He couldn't argue with that. He had spent most of his life moving forward, never dwelling on the past, never allowing attachments to slow him down. But this wasn't just any past mistake. This was a child. His child. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together. So you decided for me. Isabella met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Yes. He exhaled slowly. Why are you telling me now? She glanced at Lily, who was still focused on her drawing. Because she asked for you. His chest tightened. She's at the age where she notices things, Isabella continued. She sees other kids with their fathers. She started asking questions, wondering why she didn't have one. I didn't want to lie to her. I told her you were out there, but you didn't know about her. Edward felt like he had been punched in the gut. He had spent years believing he had everything he needed, power, success, complete control over his life. And yet, there had been a little girl out there, his own flesh and blood, wondering why he wasn't there. Lily suddenly lifted her drawing and turned it toward him with a big, proud smile. Look, Daddy. It's us. Edward blinked, caught off guard. The picture was simple, drawn with bright crayons. There were 3 stick figures, Lily in the middle, Isabella on one side, and him on the other. He was taller than the rest, wearing a suit. Lily had given him a big smile, just like hers. His throat felt tight. He took the paper from her, staring at it for longer than necessary. It's nice. His voice was rough, strained. Lily beamed. You can keep it. Edward had no idea what to say to that. He had signed billion-dollar contracts, given speeches to rooms full of people, made decisions that had shaped industries. But a 5-year-old girl handing him a crayon drawing had just completely unraveled him. Isabella watched the exchange, something soft flickering in her expression. She really believes in you, she said quietly. Edward swallowed hard. I don't want to let her down. Isabella nodded. Then don't. Edward looked back at Lily, who had already returned to coloring, completely content. He had walked into this conversation demanding answers, expecting to be angry, to be furious that he had been kept in the dark. But sitting here now, seeing his daughter for the first time, holding the proof of her love in his hands, he realized something that scared him more than anything. He wanted to be her father. And that changed everything. Edward sat in silence for a long time, staring at the crayon drawing in his hands. It was such a simple thing, just a child's sketch, but it had a weight he wasn't prepared for. Lily had drawn him into her world without hesitation, without questioning whether he belonged. To her, he wasn't a stranger. He was Daddy. That word still rattled through his mind, refusing to settle. Isabella sat across from him, arms crossed, watching him carefully. He could feel her hesitation, the unspoken questions hovering between them. She didn't trust him yet. He didn't blame her. He had only just learned the truth, and she had spent 5 years raising their daughter alone. But that didn't change the fact that he had lost time, time, and every second that passed made that loss sink deeper into his chest. Finally, he set the drawing down on the table and looked up at her. What happens now? Isabella inhaled slowly, as if she had been expecting that question but wasn't sure how to answer. That depends on you. Edward leaned forward slightly, his fingers tightening against his knees. I don't walk away from my responsibilities. His voice was firm, controlled, the way it always was when he made a decision. And I'm not walking away from her. Isabella studied him, as if searching for any sign of hesitation, any crack in his conviction. Being in her life isn't just about writing a check, Edward. His jaw tensed. I never said it was. She sighed, rubbing her temples before meeting his gaze again. She's not just some business deal you can negotiate your way into. She's a little girl. She has a routine, a life, a world that she's used to. You don't get to just step in and change everything overnight. Edward knew she was right, but that didn't make the frustration in his chest any less sharp. I don't want to take her away from you, Isabella. I just want a chance. Her expression softened, but the hesitation was still there. Then prove it. Edward ran a hand down his face, forcing himself to breathe. He wasn't used to this. He was a man who made decisions quickly, who moved from point A to point B without second-guessing. But this wasn't something he could control, something he could force. He had to earn his place, and that was something entirely new to him. Lily suddenly looked up from her coloring, her small voice cutting through the tension. Daddy, will you come to the pool with me tomorrow? Edward blinked, caught off guard. The pool? She nodded enthusiastically. Mommy takes me when she's not working. There's a slide and everything. Isabella tensed slightly, as if ready to intervene, but Edward spoke before she could. If it's okay with your mom, then yes. Lily turned to Isabella, her green eyes shining with excitement. Can he, Mommy? Isabella hesitated, her gaze flickering between them. Edward could see the internal battle playing out in her mind. He wasn't asking for everything. He was asking for one small moment. Finally, she let out a quiet breath. Okay. But just for a little while. Lily clapped her hands together, beaming. Yay! Edward felt something inside him shift. It was just an afternoon at the pool, something so small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But to Lily, it meant everything. And for the first time, he realized just how much he wanted to be part of those little moments. Isabella stood, smoothing out the front of her uniform. I have to get back to work. Her voice was steady, but there was an emotion behind it that she was trying to hide. We can meet at the pool deck at noon. Edward nodded. I'll be there. She gave him one last unreadable look before heading for the door. Lily waved at him before returning to her drawing, completely content. She had no idea how much had just changed. Edward sat there for a long time after Isabella left, staring at his daughter, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar emotions twisting inside him. He had spent his whole life chasing success, believing that nothing could shake him. But a 5-year-old girl had just changed everything. The next morning, Edward woke up earlier than he had in years. He wasn't sure if it was the anticipation or the lingering unease in his chest, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't reach for his phone the moment he opened his eyes. His usual routine was forgotten. Emails, conference calls, and stock reports didn't matter. Today wasn't about business. Today, he was taking his daughter to the pool. Even thinking the word daughter felt strange. He had spent his entire life avoiding attachments, believing that family was a distraction, something that would slow him down. But now, there was a little girl somewhere on this ship who had already decided he was her father, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And he wasn't sure if he deserved that kind of faith. By the time noon arrived, Edward had already been pacing his suite for an hour. He had never felt nervous walking into a boardroom, never second-guessed himself before making a multimillion-dollar decision. But this? This was different. He made his way to the pool deck, the afternoon sun reflecting off the water, the laughter of children filling the air. He scanned the crowd and spotted Isabella first. She was standing near the shallow end, her brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, wearing a simple sundress instead of her uniform. She looked different like this, less guarded, softer. But it wasn't her presence that made his chest tighten. It was Lily. She stood beside Isabella in a bright blue swimsuit, her dark curls pulled into a messy bun, her tiny feet bouncing on the deck with excitement. The moment she spotted him, she broke into a grin. "Daddy! You came!" The words hit him harder than they should have. He nodded, forcing himself to breathe. "Of course, I did." Lily grabbed his hand without hesitation, tugging him toward the edge of the pool. "Come on, I want to show you the slide." Edward followed her, glancing at Isabella, who was watching him carefully. There was still a wall between them, still years of silence and unspoken words. But for now, she wasn't stopping him. Lily pulled him to the steps, leading him into the water. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the second he felt the warm water surround him, something in him shifted. This wasn't a business meeting. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a moment. A small, ordinary moment that most people wouldn't think twice about. But for him, it was everything. Lily swam ahead, her laughter ringing through the air. "Watch this, Daddy." She climbed up the slide ladder, her small hands gripping the railing before pushing herself down with a triumphant giggle. Edward caught her in the water without thinking. Her little arms wrapped around his neck, her head resting against his shoulder for just a second before she pulled back, beaming up at him. "Did you see? I did it all by myself." His throat felt tight, but he nodded. "I saw. You were amazing." Lily grinned before wriggling out of his hold, already climbing up the ladder again. Isabella waded into the water nearby, her gaze cautious but unreadable. Edward glanced at her, swallowing the words he wanted to say. Instead, he let the moment speak for itself. For the next hour, he stayed by Lily's side, catching her when she jumped, listening to her endless stories about swimming lessons, and letting her wrap her tiny fingers around his wrist whenever she wanted to drag him somewhere new. He had never done anything like this before, never allowed himself to exist in a world that wasn't built on control. And yet, with every minute that passed, it felt less like a foreign experience and more like something he had been missing his entire life. Eventually, Lily's energy began to fade. Isabella wrapped a towel around her small shoulders, running a gentle hand over her damp curls. "I think that's enough excitement for today, sweetheart." Lily pouted but nodded, her eyes already drooping. She turned to Edward, hesitating for a second before reaching up to take his hand. "Will you come again tomorrow?" Edward felt the weight of her question, the quiet hope in her voice. He could see Isabella watching him, waiting for his answer. He knelt down, brushing a strand of wet hair from Lily's forehead. "I'll be here," he said, and for the first time, he truly meant it. Lily smiled sleepily and leaned into Isabella's side, already half asleep. Edward watched as Isabella picked her up effortlessly, holding her close as she murmured something softly into her ear. It was such a simple, natural thing, and yet it made something in his chest ache. As Isabella turned to leave, she paused, glancing back at him. "She's happy." Edward exhaled slowly. "I don't know what I'm doing." Isabella studied him for a moment before nodding. "Neither did I, at first." She adjusted Lily in her arms, her voice softer now. "But you showed up today. That's more than I expected." Edward watched as she walked away, disappearing into the crowd. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about what came next. For the first time, he just wanted to stay. Edward had always believed that consistency was the foundation of success. In business, in negotiations, in strategy, predictability was power. But when it came to being a father, he realized he had no blueprint to follow. There was no carefully structured plan, no step-by-step process to ensure the outcome he wanted. There was only Lily, looking up at him every morning with unwavering trust, expecting him to be there. He had kept his promise. Every day since their first trip to the pool, he had shown up. Some days, it was just a short visit, sitting with Lily while she colored in the lounge or listening to her excitedly tell him about the animals she had seen in the ship's small aquarium. Other days, they spent hours together, playing games on the deck, watching the ocean stretch endlessly beyond the horizon, or simply walking around while she held his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. It should have felt strange. He had spent years believing that family was something other men built, something that required sacrifices he had never been willing to make. And yet, every time Lily reached for him without hesitation, every time she laughed without fear that he might leave, he felt something inside him begin to shift. Tonight, he was taking her to dinner. Not in the grand, luxurious dining halls where waiters catered to the wealthiest passengers, but in the casual family restaurant Isabella had suggested. It was a place filled with bright colors, children's laughter, and no expectations of formality. Edward had never stepped foot in a place like this, but when he walked in with Lily, her tiny hand wrapped around his fingers, he realized it didn't matter. Lily bounced on her feet as they approached the hostess stand, her excitement impossible to contain. "Can we get a seat by the window?" she asked, her green eyes wide. Edward glanced at the hostess, who smiled warmly. "Of course, sweetheart. Right this way." Lily pulled him along, practically skipping toward the booth. Edward slid in across from her, still trying to shake the feeling that he was in completely unfamiliar territory. The moment they sat down, Lily grabbed the small coloring menu and a handful of crayons, already focused on filling in the empty spaces. Edward watched her, fascinated by the simplicity of it all. A few minutes later, Isabella arrived, her expression hesitant but soft. She slid into the booth beside Lily, brushing a strand of dark brown hair behind her ear. "You made it." Edward nodded, resting his elbows on the table. "I said I would." Lily didn't even look up from her coloring. "Daddy always keeps his promises." The words hit Edward harder than he expected. He glanced at Isabella, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she picked up a crayon and began filling in a small section of Lily's picture. The waitress arrived, taking their orders, and for the first time, Edward found himself in a situation he couldn't control. He wasn't leading a conversation, wasn't making decisions that would impact the future of his company. He was just a man having dinner with his daughter. Lily spoke non-stop, telling them about the sea turtles she had seen earlier, about the book Isabella had read to her the night before, about how she wanted to learn to swim without floaties. Edward listened to every word, absorbing it all like it was the most important information he had ever received. At one point, Lily looked up at him, tilting her head. "Daddy, what do you do?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" She tapped her crayon against the table. "Mommy works on the ship. Uncle Daniel is a doctor." "What do you do?" Edward hesitated. How could he explain board meetings, stock portfolios, and billion-dollar deals to a 5-year-old? "I help run a company," he said finally. Lily furrowed her brows. "Like a captain runs a ship?" Edward blinked, then let out a short laugh. "Kind of like that." Lily nodded as if this answer satisfied her. "Do you like it?" Edward opened his mouth, but no words came. He had spent years climbing to the top, believing that success was his ultimate goal. But now, sitting here with his daughter, he found himself questioning whether it had ever really been enough. Isabella must have noticed his hesitation because she spoke softly. "You don't have to have all the answers, Edward." He looked at her, something unreadable flickering between them. Lily reached across the table, patting his hand gently. "It's okay. You can tell me later." Edward swallowed the lump in his throat. "I will." The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of small moments, Lily laughing at something Isabella said, the way she kept offering Edward tiny bites of her food as if sharing was the greatest act of love she could give, the way Isabella watched them both with a quiet expression Edward couldn't quite decipher. By the time they finished eating, Lily was rubbing her eyes, her energy finally running out. Isabella scooted closer, wrapping an arm around her daughter. "Looks like someone's ready for bed." Lily yawned and leaned against Isabella's side. "Can Daddy tuck me in?" Isabella looked at Edward, waiting for his reaction. He wasn't sure why the question caught him so off guard. He had spent all this time trying to prove to himself that he could do this, that he could be part of her life. But this was real. This was trust in its purest form. He nodded. Of course. Isabella carried Lily back to their cabin, and Edward followed closely behind. When they arrived, Lily climbed into bed, pulling her blanket up to her chin. She looked at Edward expectantly. He hesitated before kneeling beside the bed. "What now?" Lily giggled sleepily. "You say goodnight and kiss my forehead." Edward swallowed past the tightness in his throat. He leaned forward, pressing a small, hesitant kiss to her forehead. "Good night, Lily." Lily smiled, her eyes already closing. "Good night, Daddy." Edward stayed there for a moment, watching as she drifted into sleep. Isabella stood by the door, arms crossed, watching him. When he finally stood, she exhaled softly. "She's already attached to you." Edward nodded, his voice quiet. "I know." Isabella hesitated, then finally asked the question he knew had been weighing on her. "Are you going to break her heart?" Edward looked at his daughter, sleeping peacefully, trusting that he would still be there when she woke up. He turned back to Isabella, his expression unreadable. "No," he said. "I won't." For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing power, success, or control. He was chasing something far more important. And he wasn't going to lose it. The next morning, Edward woke up with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. For so long, his life had been defined by one thing: success. Every decision he had made had been in pursuit of building his empire, securing his legacy, ensuring that he was always in control. But now, none of that mattered as much as the little girl who had fallen asleep the night before, trusting that he would still be there when she woke up. He had spent the past week trying to figure out how to fit into Lily's world, but the truth was, she had already decided that he belonged there. She had accepted him without question, without hesitation. The only one who had been uncertain was him. When he arrived at Isabella's cabin that morning, Lily was already waiting for him, bouncing on her heels with excitement. "Daddy, guess what?" Edward smiled at the way she said it so easily now, as if it had always been the most natural thing in the world. "What?" Lily grabbed his hand and started pulling him toward the deck. "We're going to see dolphins." Edward raised an eyebrow, glancing at Isabella, who stood in the doorway with a small, amused smile. She looked more relaxed today, though there was still a hint of hesitation in her eyes. "She's been talking about it since she woke up," Isabella said. "I figured if you wanted to come, you might as well experience what it's like when she gets excited about something." Edward let Lily drag him forward, following her to the observation area near the ship's railing. A small crowd had gathered, passengers leaning over the edge, watching the water. Lily pressed herself against the rail, her eyes scanning the ocean eagerly. "They're supposed to be here soon," she said, practically vibrating with excitement. Edward stood beside her, watching her rather than the waves. He had never been good at moments like this, ones that weren't planned, that weren't driven by goals or results. But watching his daughter light up over something as simple as spotting dolphins in the wild, he realized how much he had been missing. A few moments later, the water broke, and a sleek, silver-gray shape leapt into the air before disappearing beneath the surface again. Lily gasped, clutching Edward's sleeve. "Did you see that?" Edward nodded, unable to stop himself from smiling. "I saw." More dolphins followed, their smooth bodies cutting through the water, leaping and twisting before diving back down. Lily clapped her hands together, her joy infectious. Isabella stood a few feet away, watching them both with an expression Edward couldn't quite read. For the first time since learning the truth about Lily, Edward wasn't questioning whether or not he could do this. He wasn't thinking about what came next, about logistics, about how this would change his life. He was simply here, present, standing beside his daughter as she laughed in awe at something as simple as dolphins playing in the waves. When the moment passed and the dolphins swam off into the distance, Lily turned to him, her green eyes filled with happiness. "This is the best day ever." Edward swallowed hard, feeling something tighten in his chest. He had spent years closing himself off to emotions, to anything that could make him vulnerable. But here he was, undone by a 5-year-old's joy. Lily yawned, her excitement finally catching up to her. Isabella stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I think that's enough excitement for now," she said softly. "It's almost time for lunch." Lily nodded sleepily, but instead of turning to Isabella, she reached up for Edward's hand. "Daddy, can you carry me?" Edward froze for a second, the request so small yet so significant. He glanced at Isabella, who looked just as surprised, but she didn't stop him. Carefully, he bent down and lifted Lily into his arms. She wrapped her arms around his neck without hesitation, resting her head against his shoulder. Edward had held power in his hands before. He had signed deals that changed industries, shaken hands with men who controlled entire economies. But none of that compared to the way Lily relaxed against him, trusting him completely. As he carried her back toward the cabin, Isabella walked beside him, her expression unreadable. After a while, she let out a soft sigh. "You're really staying, aren't you?" Edward didn't hesitate this time. "Yes." She nodded, looking down at the ground for a moment before meeting his gaze again. "Then we need to figure out what that looks like." Edward knew what she meant. Their lives were completely different. He lived in a world of wealth, business, and constant movement, while she had spent the past 5 years building a life for Lily on her own. But none of that mattered anymore. "I'm not expecting everything to be perfect overnight," he said. "I just want to be part of her life. I want to make up for the time I lost." Isabella studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Then let's figure it out together." Edward exhaled slowly, feeling something settle inside him. This wasn't going to be easy. There were still challenges ahead, still questions that didn't have answers. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. Because for the first time, he had something worth fighting for. And he wasn't going anywhere. This story is about unexpected revelations, redemption, and the power of second chances. Edward Bennett starts as a man who believes he has control over every aspect of his life. He has built his success on logic, strategy, and keeping emotions at arm's length. But when he discovers he has a daughter, a little girl who instantly accepts him without question, his world shifts in a way he never could have predicted. What makes this journey so compelling is not just Edward's transformation, but also Isabella's quiet strength. She had every reason to keep her guard up, to believe that Edward would walk away just as easily as he had once done before. But she gives him the space to prove himself, not just to her but to Lily. Their story isn't one of instant forgiveness or neatly tied resolutions. It's about trust being rebuilt, step by step, through actions rather than words. Lily is the heart of it all. She doesn't carry the weight of the past the way adults do. She doesn't ask why Edward wasn't there before, she only cares that he's here now. And that is what truly changes him. For the first time, he realizes that power and wealth mean nothing if he doesn't have something real to hold on to. The ending is satisfying because it's not about perfection. It's not about Edward suddenly becoming the ideal father overnight. It's about him making a choice, choosing to stay, choosing to fight for a place in his daughter's life, choosing to be better. There are still challenges ahead, but the most important decision has already been made. It's a reminder that family isn't about being flawless. It's about showing up. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything.